Picture this. It's a foggy October morning in 1995. A yellow cab sits idling outside Murphy's Diner in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Its engine running, driver's door wide open. The radio crackles with dispatch calls that will never be answered. Inside the diner, a cup of coffee grows cold. A half-eaten slice of apple pie sits abandoned on the counter. The man who ordered them has vanished without a trace. What happened to Robert "Bobby" Chen that morning would haunt Cedar Falls for nearly 2 decades. But before we dive into one of Iowa's most perplexing disappearances, I need you to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you're going to want to follow this channel because the cases we cover will keep you awake at night, questioning everything you think you know about the people around you. And I promise you this. By the end of today's video, you will understand why sometimes the most ordinary moments can hide the most extraordinary secrets. Bobby Chen wasn't supposed to be driving a cab that October morning. In fact, he wasn't supposed to be in Iowa at all. Born in San Francisco to Taiwanese immigrants, Robert Chen had always been the responsible one in his family. At 34, he stood 5'6" with kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, a genuine smile that made passengers feel safe, climbing into his cab at 2 a.m. His hands were always clean, nails perfectly trimmed, a habit from his previous life as a computer programmer in Silicon Valley. But that life had crumbled 18 months earlier when the tech company he'd worked for went bankrupt overnight. Bobby had lost everything: his job, his savings, his fiancée Sarah, who couldn't handle the financial stress. Friends described him as devastated, but determined. Bobby never complained, his sister Linda would later tell investigators. He just quietly picked up the pieces and started over. That's what brought him to Cedar Falls, a fresh start driving for Midwest Taxi Company. Larchu, owner, Frank Morrison, had hired Bobby immediately. He was different from the other drivers, Morrison recalled. Punctual, polite, never missed a shift. He kept that cab cleaner than my own car. Bobby lived alone in a small apartment above Chen's Market. No relation, just an unfortunate coincidence that seemed to amuse him. Neighbors described him as quiet but friendly, the kind of man who'd shovel your driveway without being asked and refuse payment. He sent money to his parents in San Francisco every month, never missed Sunday dinner video calls with his family. His routine was precise, almost mechanical. Bobby would arrive at the taxi depot at 5:30 a.m. sharp, inspect his assigned vehicle, always the same yellow Crown Victoria, license plate number HYX447, and begin his 12-hour shift. He knew every street in Cedar Falls, every shortcut, every traffic pattern. Regular passengers requested him specifically. But Bobby had secrets too. He'd been attending night classes at the community college, studying accounting. His dream was to open his own bookkeeping business. He'd already saved $3,000 toward that goal, money hidden in a coffee can in his kitchen cabinet. Money that would never be found. On the surface, Bobby Chen seemed like any other hard-working immigrant chasing the American dream. But sometimes, the most ordinary people carry the most extraordinary burdens. October 23, 1995, began like any other Monday for Bobby Chen. The weather. Service recorded a temperature of 38 degrees at dawn, with heavy fog rolling in from the Cedar River. Visibility was less than 50 feet, the kind of morning that made even experienced drivers nervous. Bobby clocked in at Midwest Taxi at exactly 5:31 a.m. Dispatcher Mary Rodriguez remembered the interaction perfectly, replaying it countless times in her mind over the years. He seemed normal, she insisted. Maybe a little tired, but Bobby was always quiet in the mornings. He grabbed his thermos of coffee, checked the car, and headed out. His first fare was routine. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an elderly woman who needed rides to her dialysis appointments 3 times a week. Bobby picked her up at 6:15 a.m. from her home on Maple Street. "He seemed perfectly fine," Mrs. Patterson would tell police. "We talked about the weather, about my granddaughter's wedding. He helped me with my purse, like he always did. Such a gentleman." Bobby dropped Mrs. Patterson at Cedar Falls Medical, sent her at 6:42 a.m., and radioed dispatch for his next assignment. Mary Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. "Unit 7, we've got a pickup at the Greyhound station. Passenger heading to the airport." Bobby's response was clear and professional. "Copy that. Dispatch. Unit 7 en route." The Greyhound passenger was a businessman named Marcus Webb, traveling to Des Moines for a morning meeting. Webb later described Bobby as completely normal, maybe even more talkative than usual. They discussed the fog, the upcoming winter, Bobby's plans to expand his education. He mentioned wanting to take a vacation back to California for Christmas, Webb remembered. He seemed hopeful about the future. Bobby dropped Webb at Cedar Falls Regional Airport at 7:48 a.m. The airport security cameras captured the yellow Crown Victoria pulling away from the departure area, Bobby visible behind the wheel. It would be the last confirmed sighting of him alive. At 8:15 a.m., Bobby radioed dispatch again. "Unit 7, to base." Mary Rodriguez responded immediately. "Go ahead, Unit 7. But instead of requesting another fare, Bobby said something that would haunt her forever. "Mary, I'm going to grab a quick breakfast at Murphy's. Back in service in 20 minutes. It was unusual, but not unheard of. Drivers occasionally took short breaks, especially on slow, foggy mornings like this one. Mary logged the break and thought nothing more of it. 20 minutes turned to 40. Then an hour. At 9:30 a.m., Mary tried, reaching Bobby on the radio. Silence. She tried again every 15 minutes, her voice growing more concerned with each unanswered call. At 10:15 a.m., Mary decided to drive to Murphy's Diner herself. What she found there would make her blood run cold and launch one of Iowa's most baffling missing person investigations. The yellow Crown Victoria sat in Murphy's parking lot, engine running, driver's door hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Bobby's coffee thermos sat on the dashboard, still, warm. His clipboard with daily trip logs lay on the passenger seat, the pen he'd used to fill them out, still uncapped. Inside the diner, Booth 7 held the remnants of a breakfast that would never be finished. Coffee growing cold, apple pie with exactly 3 bites missing. But Bobby Chen had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed at all. The silence that began at Murphy's Diner that morning would echo through Cedar Falls for the next 19 years. The first police officer to arrive at Murphy's Diner was Sergeant Tom Bradley, a 20-year veteran who thought he'd seen everything. But the scene that greeted him defied explanation. The taxi's engine was still running, the keys dangling from the ignition. Bobby's wallet containing $87 and his driver's license sat untouched on the dashboard. His jacket hung on the back of the driver's seat. It was like he'd just stepped out for a second, Bradley would later testify, like he was coming right back. But Bobby Chen never came back. Within hours, Murphy's Diner became the epicenter of a massive search operation. The Cedar Falls Police Department, the Iowa State Patrol, and the FBI deployed over 200 officers and volunteers. They combed through every inch of the surrounding area. The woods behind the diner, the banks of the Cedar River, abandoned buildings throughout the county. The investigation initially focused on robbery gone wrong. but nothing supported that theory. Bobby's money remained untouched, his valuable taxi radio equipment undisturbed. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no broken glass. Security cameras from nearby businesses showed nothing unusual, just the fog-shrouded morning and Bobby's taxi arriving at exactly 8:20 a.m. Detective Sarah Martinez led the investigation and quickly identified several troubling inconsistencies. The timeline didn't make sense, she explained to reporters. Bobby was punctual to a fault. He'd never just abandoned his cab, especially with the engine running. And the waitress at Murphy's insisted she never saw him come inside, despite the evidence of his partially eaten meal. The diner's staff provided conflicting accounts. Waitress Helen Burke swore she never served Bobby that morning, yet someone had clearly ordered and partially consumed the coffee and pie found at booth 7. The cook, Jimmy Santos, claimed he heard voices from that booth around 8:30 a.m., but never saw who was talking. The cash register showed no record of the purchase. As word of Bobby's disappearance spread through Cedar Falls, theories multiplied like wildfire. Some locals whispered about the fog that morning being unnatural, describing it as thicker and more persistent than anything they'd seen before. Others pointed to Bobby's status as an outsider, suggesting anti-Asian sentiment might have played a role. The Chen family arrived from San Francisco within 48 hours. Bobby's parents, David and Grace Chen, spoke broken English, but their anguish was universal. His sister Linda became the family spokesperson, her composed exterior barely concealing her devastation. Bobby would never just leave, she told reporters. He called us every Sunday without fail. He was saving money for Christmas plane tickets. Someone took him from us. Frank Morrison, Bobby's boss at Midwest Taxi, posted a $10,000 reward for information leading to Bobby's whereabouts. "That boy was like a son to me," Morrison said, his voice cracking. "Whatever happened to him, it wasn't his choice." But as days turned to weeks with no leads, no witnesses, and no evidence, even the most dedicated investigators began to wonder if Bobby Chen had simply decided to disappear. The fog that morning had been unusually thick, they reasoned. Maybe he'd staged his own vanishing, overcome by depression from his previous failures. His sister Linda angrily rejected that theory. "You didn't know Bobby," she insisted. "He was planning his, future, not running from his past." The official search was scaled back after 30 days, but the questions remained. What had happened during those mysterious minutes between Bobby's arrival at Murphy's and Mary Rodriguez's discovery of his abandoned taxi? Why had no one seen him enter or leave the diner? And who had eaten that breakfast at booth 7? As 1995 became 1996, then 1997, the case grew cold. But in Cedar Falls, people still locked their doors a little tighter and looked over their shoulders a little more often, haunted by the unsettling truth that sometimes people just vanish into thin air. The years crawled by like a slow-healing wound for the Chen family. Linda Chen Martinez, she'd married a police officer she met during the investigation, became a fierce advocate for missing persons families across Iowa. Every anniversary of Bobby's disappearance, she organized vigils in Murphy's diner parking lot, keeping her brother's memory alive even as hope faded. David and Grace Chen aged visibly with each passing year. Grace developed a ritual of calling Bobby's old cell phone number every Sunday at the time they used to video chat, just to hear his recorded voice on the disconnected voicemail. David kept Bobby's room exactly as he'd left it during his last visit to San Francisco, down to the unread newspaper on the bedside table. The Cedar Falls Police Department officially reclassified Bobby's case as a presumed homicide in 2001. though they had no body and no suspects. Detective Martinez, now promoted to lieutenant, kept the file on her desk, adding new leads as they trickled in. Psychics offered their services. Conspiracy theorists suggested government cover-ups. None led anywhere concrete. In 2005, a hunter found a decomposed body in the woods 30 miles south of Cedar Falls. For 3 agonizing days, the Chen family believed they finally had answers. DNA testing proved it wasn't Bobby. The emotional roller coaster nearly destroyed what remained of the family's hope. Frank Morrison sold Midwest Taxi Company in 2008, unable to drive past Murphy's Diner without remembering that terrible morning. The new owners retired Bobby's cab number, 7, out of respect. They claimed the replacement vehicle for Route 7 kept having mysterious mechanical problems, though mechanics could never identify the cause. Murphy's Diner changed ownership twice, but Booth 7 remained a local legend. Some customers refused to sit there, claiming they felt an unexplained sadness. Others came specifically hoping to experience something supernatural. The new owners eventually removed the booth entirely during a renovation in 2012, but regular customers swore they could still sense something unusual about that corner of the diner. By 2010, most of Cedar Falls had moved on. New tragedies replaced old mysteries. Children who'd been toddlers when Bobby vanished were now teenagers who barely remembered the case. But Linda Chen Martinez never stopped, believing her brother was out there somewhere, waiting to come home. "Missing doesn't mean gone," she told a reporter on the 15th anniversary. "It just means we haven't found them yet." She had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. In the summer of 2014, the mystery everyone thought was buried forever would suddenly, violently, resurface in the most unexpected place imaginable. Tommy Rodriguez had been working at Salvage King's Auto Parts for 3 years when he made the discovery that would rewrite everything anyone thought they knew about Bobby Chen's disappearance. Tommy was Mary Rodriguez's nephew, the same Mary who'd been dispatching the night Bobby vanished. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. August 12, 2014, started as a typical Tuesday at the Junkyard. Tommy was processing a batch of vehicles that had been abandoned on Iowa highways, preparing them for parts harvesting. The work was dirty and routine. Drain fluids, remove valuable components, crush what remained. Around 2:30 p.m., Tommy was working on a severely deteriorated yellow sedan buried under a pile of scrap metal in the back corner of the yard. The car had been there for years, he was told, part of a bulk purchase from a defunct impound lot. As he struggled to remove the rusted trunk lid, it suddenly gave way with a screech of protesting metal. What Tommy saw inside that trunk would haunt him for the rest of his life. The skeletal remains were immediately recognizable as human. A skull, rib cage, and limbs arranged in what appeared to be a fetal position. But it was the other items that made Tommy's hands shake as he called 911. A wire-rimmed pair of glasses, a gold watch engraved with Chinese characters, and most chillingly, a taxi driver's license bearing the name Robert Chen. The Iowa State Crime Lab arrived within hours, treating the junkyard like an active crime scene. The car itself told a story investigators had been waiting 19 years to hear. License plate HYX 447 confirmed it. This was Bobby Chen's missing taxi, the yellow Crown Victoria that had sat idling outside Murphy's Diner on that foggy October morning. Dr. Amanda Foster, the state's chief medical examiner, conducted the autopsy with painstaking care. The skeleton showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, at least 3 distinct impact points suggesting a savage beating. Fabric fragments found with the remains matched the description of clothes Bobby had been wearing the day he disappeared. but the forensic evidence raised more questions than it answered. The condition of the bones suggested the body had been in the trunk for approximately 15 to 20 years, consistent with Bobby's disappearance timeline. However, the car's paperwork showed it had been sold to the impound lot in 1998, 3 years after Bobby vanished. Where had the vehicle been during those missing years? Detective Martinez, now Captain Martinez, reopened the case with renewed vigor. The IE Junkyard's records were a mess of incomplete documentation and cash transactions. The impound lot that had sold the car to Salvage Kings had been run by a man named Earl Hutchins, who died of a heart attack in 2009. His widow claimed to know nothing about how specific vehicles had ended up in their possession. The trunk itself revealed additional disturbing details. Scratches on the interior metal suggested Bobby might have been alive when placed inside, desperately trying to escape. Toxicology tests were impossible due to the advanced decomposition, but the positioning of the remains suggested he'd been bound at the wrists and ankles. Perhaps most unnervingly, investigators found Bobby's wallet inside the trunk, the same wallet witnesses had seen on the taxi's dashboard the morning he disappeared. Someone had moved it after his death, staging the scene at Murphy's Diner to make it look like a simple disappearance rather than murder. The revelation sent shockwaves through Cedar Falls. If Bobby had been killed, and his body hidden in his own taxi, who had moved the car from Murphy's parking lot? Who had eaten that breakfast in Booth 7? And why had someone gone to such elaborate lengths to conceal a murder as a missing person case? Linda Chen Martinez finally had her brother's remains, but the questions that had tormented her family for 19 years had only multiplied. The discovery of Bobby Chen's remains transformed a cold missing person case into an active homicide investigation, but the answers it provided only deepened the mystery that had haunted Cedar Falls for nearly 2 decades. Captain Sarah Martinez assembled a task force combining current detectives with retired officers who'd worked the original case. They began reconstructing that October morning with the benefit of hindsight and new evidence. The timeline they developed painted a chilling picture of premeditation and calculated deception. Based on forensic analysis, investigators now believed Bobby had been murdered somewhere other than Murphy's Diner, possibly as early as 7:50 a.m., just minutes after his last confirmed airport drop-off. His killer had then driven Bobby's body, concealed in the trunk, to the diner to stage the disappearance scene. The breakfast evidence at Booth 7 suggested the perpetrator had waited inside the restaurant, perhaps watching through the window to ensure no one discovered the abandoned taxi too quickly. But who had the knowledge and opportunity to execute such an elaborate plan? The killer clearly knew Bobby's routines, his regular stops, even his preference for Murphy's Diner coffee. This wasn't a random crime, it was personal. The investigation uncovered several previously unknown aspects of Bobby's life that cast his disappearance in a new light. Financial records revealed he'd been receiving threatening letters from his former fiancée, Sarah's brother, Marcus Webb, the same Marcus Webb who'd been Bobby's last known passenger that morning. Webb had blamed Bobby for his sister's subsequent mental health struggles and mounting debt. When confronted by investigators, Webb initially denied any involvement beyond the airport ride. But phone records revealed he'd made 3 calls to unknown numbers immediately after Bobby dropped him off. Calls made from the airport at 7:52, 7:55, and 8:03 a.m. Webb's alibi for the critical time period suddenly seemed less solid. However, Webb had boarded a confirmed flight to Taritui, Denver at 9:15 a.m., with multiple witnesses placing him at the airport gate by 8:45. Unless he'd had accomplices, he couldn't have physically committed the murder and staged the scene at Murphy's Diner. The investigation also revealed that Frank Morrison, Bobby's boss at Midwest Taxi, had been struggling financially in 1995. Insurance policies on company vehicles included substantial payouts for driver deaths in the line of duty. Morrison vehemently denied any involvement, but investigators noted he'd sold his taxi company just 13 years after Bobby's disappearance, claiming he couldn't handle the emotional stress. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Earl Hutchins, the deceased impound lot owner, had connections to both Morrison and Webb. Hutchins had worked as a mechanic at Morrison's taxi company in the early 1990s, and his business had frequently received contracts from the airport where Webb worked in security. The web of relationships suggested a conspiracy that extended far beyond a single killer. But even with these new leads, crucial questions remained unanswered. The forensic timeline indicated Bobby's taxi had been moved at least twice after his murder. Once to Murphy's Diner for the staged disappearance, then later to wherever it had been hidden for 3 years before arriving at Hutchins's impound lot. Security cameras from 1995 had long been destroyed. Witnesses' memories had faded, and key suspects were dead. Linda Chen Martinez attended every task force briefing, her 20-year grief now mixed with a desperate hunger for justice. "We know Bobby was murdered," she told reporters. "We know someone went to incredible lengths to hide that fact. But we still don't know who, or why, or exactly how it happened." In some ways, having his body back makes the mystery even more painful. The case that had begun with a man vanishing into thin air had evolved into something far more sinister. A carefully orchestrated murder disguised as a disappearance, executed by someone who knew Bobby Chen well enough to predict his every move, yet remained a phantom 19 years later. As investigators continued their work, one haunting reality emerged. Bobby's killer hadn't just taken his life, they'd stolen nearly 2 decades of peace from his family, turning their grief into a living nightmare of unanswered questions. And despite finally finding Bobby's remains, the most important question of all remained as elusive as the fog that had blanketed Cedar Falls on that October morning in 1995. Who had decided that Bobby Chen needed to disappear forever? And why had they succeeded for so long? Today, the Bobby Chen case remains officially open, though the trail has grown cold once again. The task force disbanded in 2016 after exhausting all viable leads, but Captain Martinez keeps the file active on her desk, now yellowed with age and thick with accumulated evidence that seems to point everywhere and nowhere at once. The Chendi family finally laid Bobby to rest in a small cemetery overlooking the Cedar River, not far from where he'd spent his final months building a new life. The headstone bears an inscription in both English and Chinese. "Beloved son and brother, your story is not finished." Linda Chen Martinez visits every Sunday, maintaining the ritual her mother had started with those heartbreaking phone calls years earlier. Linda has dedicated her life to cold case advocacy, helping other families navigate the unique hell of loving someone who vanished without explanation. She's testified before the Iowa State Legislature about the need for better resources for missing person investigations and has helped solve 3 other cases through her nonprofit organization, Bobby's Light Foundation. The Murphy's Diner Booth 7 was never replaced, even after the renovation. Local legend says the corner still feels different somehow, colder, sadder, as if the unanswered questions from that October morning have soaked into the very walls. The diner's current owner, Maria Santos, sometimes finds fresh coffee cups on the counter in the mornings, though she's certain the restaurant was empty when she locked up the night before. Frank Morrison passed away in 2018, taking whatever secrets he might have held to his grave. His daughter found a sealed envelope in his effects labeled, "For Bobby's Family." But it contained only a brief apology note and a check for $5,000. Money Linda donated to victim advocacy programs rather than keep for herself. Marcus Webb, Bobby's final passenger, was killed in a car accident in Phoenix in 2019. His death eliminated the last person known to have interacted with Bobby on the morning he disappeared, closing another potential avenue for answers. The yellow crown Victoria that served as Bobby's tomb was eventually crushed and recycled, but not before investigators had examined every inch multiple times. If it held additional secrets, they went to the scrap heap with the twisted metal. Some evidence, it seems, is destined to remain buried forever. Perhaps most unsettling of all, the method used to murder Bobby Chen and stage his disappearance suggests a level of planning and local knowledge that could only come from someone deeply embedded in the Cedar Falls community. Bobby's killer might have attended his memorial services, might have offered comfort to his grieving family, might have lived among the townspeople for years while harboring the darkest of secrets. In quiet moments, when the Iowa wind whistles through the cemetery where Bobby finally rests, Linda Chen Martinez sometimes wonders if she's unknowingly spoken to her brother's killer. Has she shaken hands with the person who destroyed her family? Has she smiled politely at the monster who turned Bobby's dreams of a fresh start into a 19-year nightmare? The case of Bobby Chen reminds us that some mysteries resist even our most determined efforts to solve them. Sometimes the fog that rolls in on an October morning never fully lifts, leaving us to navigate by instinct and hope rather than clear sight. Sometimes justice remains as elusive as the truth, and the questions that haunt us become the only answers we'll ever have. But Bobby's story isn't finished. Somewhere in the files of the Cedar Falls Police Department, in the memories of longtime residents, in the DNA databases that grow larger each year, the final pieces of this puzzle may still be waiting. Technology advances. Witnesses' consciences evolve. Deathbed confessions sometimes reveal decades-old secrets. Until then, Bobby Chen's legacy lives on in the families who refuse to stop searching, in the investigators who won't let cold cases gather dust, and in the quiet promise that some disappearances are only temporary, even if temporary lasts longer than a human lifetime. The taxi driver who vanished at dawn in 1995 has finally come home, but the person who sent him into that final night remains a ghost, walking free among us, carrying secrets that grow heavier with each passing year. And in Cedar Falls, Iowa, people still lock their doors a little tighter when the fog rolls in,